Hello there and good afternoon dear viewers. You are watching L24 News Special and continuous coverage of the developments of the Zionist occupation's aggression on Gaza Strip. A ceasefire between the Zionist entity and the Palestinian militants held overnight following 3 days of violence. At least 44 or 45 people have been killed in the most serious eruption between the two sides since 11 days conflict in May 2021. The ceasefire ended more than 2 days of intense cross-border violence that started on Friday when Zionist army killed Islamic jihadist Taysir al-Jabari, the group's chief of operations in the northern Gaza Strip. And on Saturday, Zionist army killed Khalid al-Mansour, the head of the Islamic jihadist operation in the southern Gaza, in an airstrike that wrecked a house in Rafah near the border with Egypt. Zionists and the Palestinian diplomats had said that Sunday afternoon the talks of a ceasefire through Egyptian and Qatari back channels were progressing. A fragile ceasefire deal to end nearly 3 days of fighting between the two sides in Gaza held into Monday morning, a sign the latest round of violence may have abated. And to analyze more the situation, I'm joined live by Mr. Abdel Noor Toumi, Maghreb Studies expert at Orzam Middle East Eastern Studies Center in Ankara from Turkey or Turkey, and Abdullah Al-Ahsan, professor in comparative civilization and expert in the Islamic issues from USA, and Muti' Musbah, a Palestinian activist from Ramallah, Palestine. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to our debate, a short debate and the jungle. Now let's start the discussion. Let's start with some updates before we delve into our discussion. A truce between the Zionists and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militant group was announced late on Sunday, raising hopes that the worst flare-up on the Gaza border in more than a year would come to an end. According to Egyptian intelligence officials, a deal had been reached to end the violence in Gaza that has resulted in the deaths of numerous Palestinians. They called for a ceasefire to start at 11:30 p.m. and committed to work for the release of Sheikh Bassam al-Saadi and the prisoner Khalil al-Wawda, while an agreement like that might push Zionists to break the ceasefire as usual.
بعد جهود مصرية وأممية
After the vital Egyptian international efforts, and in light of the Egyptian announcement of the Egyptian commitment to work for the release of Sheikh Bassam al-Saadi and the prisoner Khalil al-Wawda, we, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, announced the entry into the ceasefire agreement as of 11:30 in the evening of this Sunday, 7 August 2022, and we confirm that we will abide by the ceasefire as long as the enemy adhere to it.
Mr. Abdel, I'll be starting with you. What can you say about these 3 days of airstrikes from both sides? The Zionist entity claimed that they have killed the main targets of this operation, top leaders of Islamic jihadist group Khalid Mansour and Taysir al-Jabari. And to this end, the Zionist leaders could agree on the Egyptian deal to ceasefire after having reached their objective. In other words, if they didn't reach their goal, could they keep this airstrike goes longer?
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for having me, and good afternoon to your special guest and to the Al24 News viewers. It is indeed, as far as the conflict goes, and this is not new, and the colonial states always capitalize on these, but the authorities of the Zionist states call it objectives or wherever they can call it. But it is in the dynamic of the long permanent tension process that they set from the early of the occupation of the Palestine, and their narrative it has some, I would say, chronological order. It goes first with Arab states, then they choose their enemy. It went on with the PLO, then with Hamas, and now with Jihad. But the question is how long these conflicts will go, and also the interesting point here, of course, I mean, the people in Gaza are suffering a great deal, and this has been going on for the last, I would say, 15 years. And as many observers are describing the situation in Gaza as an open-air jail for holding more than 2 million people. But the question is, it's not a humanitarian crisis. I mean, the West, the hypocrite West, and also the so-called international community, they describe this as if Gaza was hit by a hurricane. No, it is an occupation. It's a harsh occupation and an acculturation process. This needs to be looked at seriously, but apparently the international community, and led by the main Western leaders, notably the US, doesn't care much about this, so that the Europeans and unfortunately now Arab leaders are divided on this in the light of this so-called normalization for some and other banalization for others. But the question here is how the Palestinian factions and within the resistance, how they can set up the Palestinian house and face these enemy with now, I would say, new imperatives of the resistance today. And this is, I mean, in the light of these 3 days, I would call it round. But the main element here was a year ago when the entire dynamic was set of the Palestinian resistance that is showing its strength and also changing the dynamic of the conflicts. Therefore, the new, I would say, elements are in this conflict. Now, we are not talking about just a resistance, but also it looks like a serious liberation movement for the entire occupied Palestine.
Perfectly understood and derived from your words. Coming to Mr. Abdullah Al-Ahsan, how can you explain the claims of both sides? Zionist army said that we have had targets to kill behind this operation, and the Palestinian resistance said in the Islamic Jihad group said that our airstrikes toward the occupier to show them that we are strong than ever before and we will continue fighting till the end. How can you explain this? Is this really, and now, ending up with the truce, is it really fragile truce that it won't last for longer?
I don't think that one can explain why Israel time and again comes back and attack Gaza or occupied territories. Fundamentally, my impression is that Israel is not interested in peace. Israel wants to continue with the conflict whenever there is a possibility of some kind of adjustment. When I remember clearly in 2009 and 2014, whenever attempts were made, particularly those days by Turkey, to bring both parties to some kind of understanding, some kind of peaceful coexistence, Israel attacks Gaza and demolishes all the things that was achieved earlier. So my impression is that if a party is not interested in peace, how can you guarantee that there will be no conflict, no war? It is not conflict, it is just one-sided. Yes, of course, here you can see that jihad is responding with some kind of shelling, but these are nothing as opposed to the kind of shelling that Israel is doing on Gaza. So I think you see someone who is dying, who is trying to survive will take shelter of anything that he finds around. So this kind of reaction from the Islamic Jihad is compared to that kind of, they are just trying to survive. Israel is no comparison to their response. And therefore, my understanding is that until and unless Israel could be brought to follow, say, UN resolutions, I mean, just look at the history. 1948, the United Nations appointed Count Bernadotte to bring some kind of understanding between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And although Count Bernadotte was very famous for saving so many Jews during the Second World War, he was assassinated by Israeli terrorists. And one of these terrorists later became Prime Minister of Israel. So how can you have peace with this kind of mentality? That's my question. I don't have an answer to your question, but I have more questions to raise. Thank you.
Question understood. Unfortunately, it really hurts, but this is the ugly truth. Palestine now is someone who is dying and looking to survive. Coming to you, Mr. Muti', the Secretary General of the Islamic Jihad, Zaid al-Nakhala, announced that if Zionist entity does not abide by what was agreed up and through the Egyptian mediator, the movement will resume fighting. Mr. Muti', do you really think the Zionist army won't respect the deal of this truce and release the Sheikh Bassam Saadi and the prisoner Khalil Awawda?
Yes, first of all, thanks for having me. Actually, I'm from Gaza, not from Ramallah.
Okay, that would be good.
It's my pleasure to join you and to join your guests in this interview. Actually, although the dust of the Israeli airstrikes settled here in Gaza, but actually the suffering and the pain of the Palestinian people who were targets for those airstrikes are still continued. And actually all over the world actually have watched how the situation here was in the last couple of days. The main target for those airstrikes were the Palestinian children and the Palestinian civilians, which revealed the real face of the Israeli occupation. So what we have witnessed here is a flagrant massacre committed against the Palestinian children and the Palestinian civilians, which killed more than 45 Palestinians and injured more than 360 Palestinians in that massacre. So amid all of that, I think there are many topics that we need to have in our consideration. The first thing is that this aggression actually was waged furtively from the Israeli side after the Egyptian mediations actually took place and were going on, because as you know that the Egyptian party was trying to have some kind of mediation and in order to diffuse the tension and to de-escalate the situation, but the Israeli occupation actually attacked the Palestinian prominent leader in Jihad Islami, Taysir al-Ja'bari, killing him and with his bodyguards. So this is the first thing that in order to be understand and in order to be clear that Israel is the party that began that kind of aggression. This is very important. Secondly, this aggression actually comes amid the tightened Israeli siege imposed on Gaza, leaving Gaza in a devastating situation. We have here a wide-scale devastation on the infrastructure. We have here a fragile health sector and collapsed health sector. We have here deteriorating humanitarian conditions, and the Palestinian people are already suffering from that kind of siege imposed since more than for more than 15 years in a row. Thirdly, and I think this is very important, that this aggression actually waged against the Palestinian people amid or in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, which actually reveals how the double standards that the international community has when the Palestinian people are being attacked and are being slaughtered.
Understood, Mr. Motir. I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, but we have a certain point we will discuss about the Russian military operation and the double standards of the world. Now, moving on to the second point, a ceasefire deal ends the Zionist assault on the Gaza Strip, which has taken at least 44 lives. The shelling on the residential areas left as well at least 15 children killed in 3-day-long bombardments and more than 360 wounded. Zionist shelling damaged at least 1,600 Palestinian residential units. Mr. Abdul Noor, coming back to you, how will the Zionist entity explain the death of 44 innocent civilians to the United Nations and to the Security Council? What could the explanation of this destruction, I don't know, how to explain this to the world?
Actually, it is. I mean, the Zionist state, again, doesn't care about the international law nor the international community, notably about the member of the Security Council. And they know where they are well supported. I mean, they have a solid partner is watching their back. So this is, again, I think, as one of your guests put it, Israel, the colonial state is not interested in peace because now, sure, this process, the Palestinians has become to them, it's like a tyrant process because they went through and they have been going through for decades. I mean, there is, again, a disproportionate scale of violence, and then the Zionist state leaders, for, of course, domestic imperatives, I mean, they put this just to score for political, domestic politics vis-a-vis their voters, and then they leave the Palestinians divided. It's an interesting point here. I mean, the colonial state leaders did understand very well since the Oslo Accords that the Palestinians are divided. Therefore, their strategy of divide and impera seems is working for them. So now, what they are missing, and with this new leadership in the Zionist state that with zero experience on the, let's say, war, so on the other hand, the Palestinian resistance is coming very, very strong. And this is actually this weekend, I would say, around battle fight with the jihad is a solid message for them because I think to some point the colonial state leaders, again, were watching closely not to provoke too much Gaza, not to let Hamas jump in. So now, again, they have two, I would say, serious adversaries / enemies in Gaza now, and sure they are coordinating. I mean, Hamas and the jihad are coordinating closely, but for Hamas leaders, they reacted wisely because they knew well the escalation will go very, very harsh again on the population. So, to answer to your question explicitly, it's very hard because again, the colonial states doesn't want to admit that the Arabs are extending their hands, and we saw that from the Oslo Accord, and then the Arab Initiative of Beirut 2002, and they don't care about that. So now there is a new dynamic in this conflict. As I said earlier, it started last year, and the message was like there is a new resistance, therefore a new liberation for an entire liberation movement to liberate entire Palestine. And this is today, it goes, and it doesn't go well for the strategy of the Zionist state leaders who are or have been capitalizing on, let's say, the factor the time factor and using the clock to, let's say, let this dynamic, which I call it humbly, the permanent tensions in the region, therefore changing the dynamic and the narrative of the conflict itself. Meaning by this, here we are, I would say, or I would argue, we are between two scenarios. There is the South African scenario and the book of Jimmy Carter that was, came out in 2006, I believe, titled of Palestine state, not apartheid. And I think he chose carefully the word apartheid. And the other scenario is the Algerian one. And the resistance, the Palestinian resistance today are in Algerian, let's say, pre-war of liberation of 1954. They are in post-45 tragedies and massacres of Saif, Gelman, Kharada that led and united the Algerian nationalist movement and went for the entire liberation of its land from harsh occupation. So that here today the Palestinians are in this situation.
Perfect. Now, before coming to you, Mr. Abdullah Al-Ahsan, I will give you this piece of information. Previously, we have phoned the Palestinian ambassador to Algeria, Mr. Fayyaz Mohammed Mahmoud Abu Ita. He talked about the global double standards on the Palestinian issue, saying that everyone denounced the Russian military operation in Ukraine, but no one is talking about the Zionist entity's repeated crimes against the unarmed people in Palestine.
Yes.
This question must be addressed to the international community, particularly to the United States of America and to the European countries, which have taken contrary position on the Russian military operation in Ukraine at a time when the Palestinian people are subjected to terrible massacres, but no one dares directly to condemn the Zionist entity for these crimes. No one stands with the Palestinian people whom their lands are being taken by force daily. Who wants to condemn the aggression against sovereignty of other countries should condemn this Zionist entity persistent and repeated attacks against the Palestinian people on a daily basis. United States should review its positions and abide by the principles of international law and human rights principles it proclaims on a daily basis.
Mr. Abdullah Al-Ahsan, the Palestinian ambassador in Algeria stated clearly that US and United Nations should review their position when it comes to Palestine. Why does US always keep turning a blind eye when the attacker is the Zionist entity, unlike the case with Russia and Iran?
Yes, this is a very valid point, but this is not the first time that you see this double standard. I referred to you event of 1948 when they assassinated the UN negotiator in the conflict. So since then, in fact, since the very beginning, they say that they fought a war of independence in 1948. What independence? Was the territory of Palestine inhabited by the Israelis or Jewish people? No, it was almost 90%. There were only 5 to 6% Jewish population there in the area. So since then, they are, advancing their cause and taking other territories. Just imagine if today the original Americans, I don't call them Red Indians or, the original population of America, they come forward and they say that all Europeans should leave America. What will happen? So we should take this, the solution to the problem does not lie in Palestine. it lies to the international community. And international community, there are so many people who would agree with the kind of double standard that United States, in the shadow of the United Nations, are doing. People have to stand up for this. And for this, only way, to my understanding, is that we educate the people around the world about what is happening. Israel has to be told that they have to behave in a civilized way. The kind of behavior Israel is demonstrating since 1948 is not a civilized behavior. They don't know how to treat humankind with dignity. So, United States, European Union, and of course the United Nations, they have to be convinced that what is happening is wrong, and that can be done only through public pressure. Pressure has to be created all over the world. In the United States now, you see, these days we are seeing primaries going on within the parties, which candidate will contest in the elections in November. And in these AIPAC, the American-Israeli Public Relations, this AIPAC, the lobby group, is financing heavily. Now, one should raise question that this behavior of money politics, we always say that third world countries are engaged in money politics. Money politics is going on inside the United States. And I really appreciate that you are conducting this program and trying to educate people all over the world, including inside the United States. That is the only solution that I can see to this problem. Thank
Perfectly understood and appreciated for the point you have raised. Coming to Mr. Muti' Musbah, as a Palestinian, precisely you are now in Gaza, do you really believe that the Western leaders represented by USA will ever give the right to Palestine over this occupier?
Yes, actually, the Palestinian people are not waiting for the U.S. administration to give them their rights. The only thing we want from the international community, and we are asking that the international community and the whole world, is just to stop supporting the Israeli occupation, stop showing more bias to the Israeli occupation at the expense of the blood of the Palestinian people, simply because the Israeli occupation understands that kind of support as a green light to commit more and more crimes. And this is exactly what we are witnessing here in Gaza. The more the U.S. shows more support for the U.S., for the Israeli occupation, the more crimes are being committed against the Palestinian people. And let's be clear, that this kind of cruelty and the brutality shown by the Israeli occupation against the Palestinian civilians here in Gaza or across all Palestinian territories, we can notice that these attacks are intensified after the Biden visit, after the U.S. President Biden visited the Israeli occupation and showed more support and displayed more support and assistance for the Israeli occupation. So this is our simple recommendation, as simple actually order for the international community, just to stop supporting the Israeli occupation. And we as Palestinian people realize clearly that without that kind of support, Israel would never dare to commit its crimes. Israel feels immune to any kind of, Israel still feels immune to any kind of sanctions, to any kind of punishment. And this is the main reason behind that kind of cruelty and the brutality showed against the Palestinian people. Mm-hmm. So the first thing amid all these developments, the first thing that the international community and the whole world needs is just to show more seriously, to be more, to show more serious actions and more serious steps towards the Israeli occupation, just for the Israeli occupation to understand that there are some kind of consequences and repercussions that he could that could be imposed against him, against that occupation for that kind of crimes. But it's not acceptable, and it's not allowed for the international community to keep silent in its best situation towards those crimes, and to equate the victim and the slaughterer in this situation when the international community and the UN and the other human rights organizations and bodies ask both sides just to calm down and to restore the calmness here in the situation and to end the violence. I think this is a flagrant equation between the victim, the Palestinian people, and the slaughterer, the Israeli side. The Palestinian people need to be protected from the Israeli occupation, from the Israeli attacks. The Palestinian people are not asking, are just asking for their rights, their legitimate rights that any people around the world is asking for, just to live in freedom and dignity without having that kind of killing and shedding the blood.
When someone is at right, you just talk from the bottom of his heart. Thank you so much for your words, Mr. Moutir. Now, staying with the ambassador of the Palestine in Algeria, the Palestinian ambassador to Algeria, Mr. Fayyaz Mohammed Abu Ita, he praised the efforts done so far by the Algerian government. In particular, the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, and the Foreign Ministry saying that there is a great hope for the Palestinian cause since the Arab Summit will be held in Algeria next November.
This summit will be held in Algeria and under Algeria's presidency. This gives us a great hope, indeed, that the Arab nation will be restored to normal relations and put it again on the right track. You know that many Arab countries directly or indirectly disavow the Palestinian cause and the Arab consensus that rejected normalization with this entity. I believe that Algeria is making a great efforts, including painstaking political and diplomatic campaign by President Abdelmajid Tebboune and the Minister of Foreign Affairs to resuscitate the Arab nation and common convoys to bring Arab siblings together with the success of this summit to restore the spirit of the Arab body that has been so damaged in the past years.
So, as you have heard, the Palestinians have a great hope on the forthcoming Arab Summit that will be held in Algeria because they believe Algeria is a key factor to finding a resolution to the Palestinian cause. What are you saying about this? And in between brackets, what are you saying about those countries whom they work in normalization with this entity?
You are asking me?
Yes, Mr. Abdel Noor.
Okay. Yes, I mean, and this is not any surprise by any means, knowing the role of Algeria toward the legitimate cause, the legitimate Palestinian cause. And of course, I mean, even from the legal point, and I mean, the proclamation of the Palestinian state was announced in Algiers in 1988, and also we recall that, I mean, in the integral process of the Arab League, that sadly is not doing enough, but Algeria has been always an active actor and pushing for the Palestinian legitimate cause and also bringing the Palestinian factions together. And this goes back in the Intifada Summit of 1987. And this is why today we are having, a huge hope on the leading role of Algeria in the regional level, and notably on the process of the next fall Arab League meeting to bring the Arabs together and also to bring the Palestinians together as a direct answer to the colonial state that has been capitalizing on the division of the Palestinians, and also to some extent itself to put and make Gaza as the main narrative of this conflict, which is not true. I mean, the entire dynamic of the conflict is occupation, and there are no differences between the Palestinians who are in Gaza and the one who are in the West Bank, and even in the occupied territories of 48. So this is why Algeria now is again trying very, very hard to bring the Palestinian factions together and put in front the Palestinian cause, because very interesting element here and point I want to make, the Abraham Accords objectives is to bury the Palestinian cause and the Palestinians' legitimate cause.
Perfect, perfect. Coming to you, Mr. Abdullah Al-Ahsan, what is your reading to the ambassador's words? He blamed the Arabic countries who normalized relations with the entity, saying that they denounced themselves regarding the Palestinian cause. But now, the Algerian efforts attempt to bring the Arab all together again. Will the Arab really be united again and form a strong front against the occupier in the Palestine?
I just would like to be hopeful, like you said that Palestinians are becoming hopeful because of this. I also would like to be hopeful. In fact, Algeria has played very positive role. Many occasions you will see that Algeria has come and taken the stance to support not only the Palestinians, in many other causes around the world for human dignity and human rights. So that must be appreciated. And you know that the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, was established in the context of a Palestinian crisis. And yet, many of these OIC crises, among them there are so many Arab countries, they are trying to establish normal relations with Israel. These are all against the resolutions they have adopted throughout history. Now, so-called Abrahamic covenant, Abrahamic document that they are signing, is it really Abrahamic? Did Abraham go against human dignity? The whole argument is so faulty, and yet they are proceeding in the name of business, in the name of civilization, and civilization for them is the material progress. This is not going to work. Throughout history, we have seen that this kind of civilization does not last long. Therefore, I definitely support I would like to be hopeful on the stance that Algeria has taken. And here I would also like to highlight the stance that has been taken by South Africa. The ANC has come up with a very strong statement, a very fair statement on the issue of Israeli attack on Gaza. And I hope the rest of the world takes lesson from this Algerian and South African example. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. Coming to you, Mr. Mouti', what are you saying about this? What is your expectation of this summit that will be held in Algeria under an Algerian presidency?
Yes, first of all, our deep thanks to our brothers and to the Algerian regime for their efforts to end the division and to reconcile the Palestinian people together. And actually, there is a wide consensus that the division is a stab in the back of the Palestinian people, and it's an obstacle that stands between the Palestinian people and practicing more effective resistance against the Israeli occupation. And it's better for us as Palestinians just to face the Israeli occupation united rather than being separated or divided. This is very important, and we Palestinians understand this clearly. But I think that we have here some main obstacles that could actually hinder the achieving that kind of reconciliation and ending that division. The first thing is that the pressure practiced by different parties, especially from the Israeli occupation on the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority actually is supposed to reject all that kind of pressure in order to be more effective in this way. And in order to ending that kind of division, the Palestinian people is urgently needed and recommended to just refuse that kind of a pressure as we know, that it's an interest for the Israeli occupation just to keep the Palestinian people divided. And as the whole region actually is moving in the sphere of the United States and the U.S. administration, they are just trying to coexist with that kind of situation, and they are just trying to go in line with this attitude of the Israeli occupation just to keep the Palestinian people divided without any kind of unity. So I think it's a hard mission for the Palestinian Authority mainly, and for those brokers and those mediators who are just trying to have a positive stance in this regard. So we expect that all in all, it depends on the position of the Palestinian Authority mainly to refuse the agenda of the Israeli occupation imposed upon it, and to impose the foreign, let me say, the interference of the foreign countries that just try to portray the Palestinian issue as just kind of a humanitarian issue that needs some kind of financial aid without having any kind of political solution or any kind of political development on any side. So this is the first thing. Secondly, I think that the normalization agreements that signed between the Israeli occupation and the many Arab regimes actually represent a stab in the back of the Palestinian people.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mr. Muti', but we have reached the limit of our time. Mr. Hassan Abdullah from USA, Mr. Muti' from Palestine, Mr. Abdel Nourtoumi from Turkey, thank you ever so much for taking part in our debate. And a special coverage will be also held tomorrow over the latest. Thank you and bye-bye.